Imagine the silence of a ghost town where the air itself carries whispers of the past. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone holds secrets no one dares to face until now. Tonight, follow a story of courage, betrayal, and survival. Listen closely, every detail could mean the difference between life and death. Chapter 1: Shadows in the Zone. The road into the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone was shrouded in a heavy mist, its eerie stillness broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath the tires of an old van. 5 strangers sat in uneasy silence, their faces lit by the dim glow of a GPS screen. Each of them carried their own reasons for coming to this desolate place, though none dared speak of them. In the driver's seat was Victor, a seasoned stalker who knew every inch of the zone. His sharp eyes skimmed the fog, searching for movement. Beside him sat Anna, a young journalist chasing the ultimate story, her recorder clutched tightly in one hand. In the back were Pavel, a grizzled ex-soldier with a haunted gaze, Lena, a scientist obsessed with the mysteries of radiation, and Dima, a thrill-seeker who treated the journey like a dangerous game. The van rolled to a stop at the edge of the forest. "This is as far as we go," Victor announced, his voice low and commanding. "The rest is on foot." They stepped into the damp, cold air. Pripyat lay just ahead, its ghostly skyline barely visible through the haze. The city, abandoned after the 1986 disaster, was a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and forgotten memories. Victor led the way, his Geiger counter crackling softly in the silence. As they entered the outskirts, the world seemed to hold its breath. Rusted swings creaked in the wind, and the skeletal remains of apartment blocks loomed overhead. Anna snapped pictures while Dima joked nervously. Pavel stayed close to Lena, his hand never straying far from the knife at his belt. "Stick together," Victor warned, his tone brooking no argument. "The zone is alive. It watches, waits. You don't want to get lost here." They reached an old school, its entrance gaping like a black maw. Victor hesitated before stepping inside. "This building's clean enough. We'll rest here tonight." The group set up camp in the decrepit gymnasium. Anna lit a lantern, casting flickering shadows on the peeling walls. Lena unpacked her equipment, muttering about anomalies in radiation levels. Dima wandered off, ignoring Victor's sharp reprimand, and returned moments later with a rusted tricycle. "This place is giving me the creeps," Anna admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it remembers." Pavel stared into the darkness, his expression grim. "Places like this don't forget." The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. A distant thud echoed through the building, followed by a low, guttural sound. Everyone froze. Victor signaled for silence, his hand gripping a worn pistol. The noise grew louder, closer, and then stopped. "Stay here," Victor ordered, his voice firm. "I'll check it out." Anna grabbed his arm. "You're not going alone." "I'm always alone," he replied, pulling free and disappearing into the shadows. The remaining group huddled together, their breath shallow. Minutes passed like hours. When Victor returned, his face was pale. "We're not alone," he said. "Pack up. We leave now." As they hurriedly gathered their things, the sound returned, closer and unmistakably human. Whispers, fragmented and unintelligible, surrounded them. Anna's recorder, left running on the floor, picked up faint words: "Help, stay, don't." Dima bolted for the door, panic in his eyes. Before anyone could stop him, a deafening scream echoed from the hallway. When they found him, his body was sprawled in a pool of blood, his face twisted in terror. The others stared in horror at the claw-like marks raked across his chest. Victor swore under his breath. "We shouldn't have come here." They fled into the night, leaving behind the safety of the building. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent. As they reached the edge of the city, Lena stumbled, dropping her bag. The equipment inside shattered, sending radiation monitors and notebooks spilling onto the ground. "Leave it!" Pavel yelled, dragging her forward. "No!" Lena screamed. "It's my life's work." Victor hesitated, then grabbed her arm. "You'll die here if you don't move." The group pressed on, their terror driving them deeper into the zone. Ahead lay the reactor, its decaying structure glowing faintly under the moonlight. None of them knew what awaited, but each felt the chilling certainty that the horrors of Pripyat were only the beginning. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Past. The group trudged onward, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Victor led them toward the reactor, his jaw set in grim determination. Behind him, Anna clutched her camera like a talisman, her hands trembling. Lena stumbled, her breathing ragged, while Pavel kept a protective hand on her shoulder. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of Victor's Geiger counter. Pripyat had been unnerving, but the zone beyond the city felt alive, malevolent. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, and strange sounds echoed through the trees, distant footsteps, faint whispers, the rustle of leaves where no wind stirred. Lena glanced over her shoulder, certain she saw movement. When she turned back, Victor's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Eyes forward. We stick together. The group reached a clearing where the reactor loomed in the distance, its sarcophagus cracked and crumbling. The sight of it sent a shiver through Anna. It was a monument to human hubris, a reminder of the disaster that had claimed countless lives. Yet now it felt like more, a warning, a grave marker for something far worse. Victor halted, raising a hand. We rest here. No fire, no light. Stay close. They huddled together, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Lena pulled out her backup radiation monitor and frowned at the readings. Levels are spiking, she whispered. We shouldn't be here. We don't have a choice, Victor replied. There's no turning back. Anna's curiosity got the better of her. Why are we really here, Victor? What are you telling us? His gaze was unreadable. I've been here before. There's something in the reactor, a signal. It's been broadcasting for years. Some say it's a warning. Others, he trailed off, his expression darkening. Others think it's alive. Anna's stomach churned. Alive? What does that mean? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a map and marked their next destination, an underground bunker near the reactor. We'll find answers there. If we're lucky. The hours passed slowly, unease growing among the group. Pavel stood watch, his knife glinting faintly in the moonlight. Lena tried to make sense of her readings, but the data was chaotic, almost nonsensical. Anna reviewed her photos, gasping when she noticed faint, ghostly figures in the background of several shots. These weren't there before, she whispered, showing Pavel. His face hardened, but he said nothing. As dawn approached, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. The group snapped to attention, their fear palpable. From the shadows emerged a figure, a man, gaunt and unsteady, his face pale as death. He wore the remnants of an old hazmat suit, the insignia faded and torn. Help me, the man croaked, collapsing to his knees. Victor approached cautiously, gun drawn. Who are you? The man coughed, blood staining his lips. The reactor, it's calling. Don't go. Why? Victor demanded. What's inside? The man's eyes widened in terror. It's not what, it's who. Before anyone could react, the man convulsed violently, his body seizing. His screams were guttural, inhuman. A dark mist seemed to seep from his pores, coiling like smoke. Pavel lunged forward to help, but Victor held him back. Don't touch him. Victor barked. The man's body collapsed into ash, the mist dissipating into the air. The group stared in horror, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. We have to leave, Lena pleaded. This place, it's wrong. Victor shook his head. We can't stop now. Reluctantly, they followed him toward the reactor. The air grew heavier with each step, the Geiger counters crackled, becoming a constant, unnerving hum. When they reached the bunker, it was almost a relief to be underground, away from the suffocating presence of the zone. The bunker was a relic of the Soviet era, its metal walls streaked with rust. Inside, they found abandoned equipment and shelves lined with documents. Anna eagerly rifled through the papers, her flashlight casting long shadows. "These files," she murmured. "They're experiments. They were testing something here, something to do with radiation and consciousness." "What kind of experiments?" Pavel asked, his voice low. "People," Anna replied, her face pale. "They were using people." Lena's voice trembled. "They were trying to merge human consciousness with the reactor's energy. They thought they could create a new kind of intelligence." Victor cursed under his breath. "That's why the zone feels alive. It's not just radiation. It's them." The realization hit the group like a physical blow. The whispers, the figures in the photos, the man who had disintegrated, they weren't anomalies. They were remnants of the experiments, trapped in a cycle of torment. A sudden crash jolted them back to the present. The bunker door slammed shut, and the lights flickered. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the air, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. "They know we're here," Victor said, his voice grim. "Get ready." The group huddled together, their fear giving way to determination. Whatever waited outside, they would face it together, or die trying. Chapter 3: The Reactor's Call. The bunker's air grew stifling, a mix of metallic tang and an unshakable sense of dread. The flickering lights cast erratic shadows that danced along the rusted walls, making it seem as though unseen figures moved among them. The growling beyond the door became louder, more insistent, and the scraping of claws against metal set everyone's nerves on edge. "Barricade the door," Victor ordered. Pavel and Anna sprang into action, shoving a rusted cabinet against it. Lena fumbled with her equipment, her hands trembling as she tried to record the radiation levels. The numbers on her monitor jumped erratically, climbing higher than she had ever seen before. "This shouldn't be possible," she whispered. "We're not even near the reactor core." "Focus," Victor snapped, pulling her attention back. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with." Anna sifted through the scattered documents, her flashlight illuminating faded blueprints and scribbled notes in Russian. She read aloud, her voice shaking. "Project Prometheus, an attempt to weaponize the zone's energy. They thought they could harness the radiation, control it, but something went wrong. They lost control." Pavel growled under his breath. "Lost control? This whole place is a graveyard because of their arrogance." A loud bang against the door silenced him. The group froze as the sound came again, more forceful. Whatever was out there was not going to wait forever. Victor raised his pistol, motioning for silence. The banging stopped. For a brief moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint hum of the bunker's decaying power systems. Then, a voice, a low, distorted echo, filtered through the cracks in the door. It was neither entirely human nor machine, and its words chilled them to the bone. "Join us. Become one." Anna's flashlight flickered, and for an instant, the shadows on the wall coalesced into the shape of a man, tall, imposing, and impossibly wrong. His outline flickered as though he existed on the edge of reality, his face indistinct but his presence undeniable. "Did you see that?" Anna gasped, clutching Pavel's arm. He nodded, his usual stoicism shaken. "We're leaving," Victor said firmly. He turned to Lena. "What's the safest path to the reactor?" "The safest?" Lena's voice cracked. "None of this is safe. If we go to the reactor, we're walking into the heart of whatever this is." "We have no choice," Victor replied. "If we stay here, we're dead." Reluctantly, the group gathered their things. Victor led the way, his pistol drawn, as they slipped out through a side passage. The air was colder now, each breath a visible puff. The whispers had returned, louder and more persistent, filling their ears with fragments of broken sentences. "They see you. Stay. Leave." Anna gritted her teeth, focusing on the path ahead. The tunnels were a maze of decay and darkness, the faint light of their flashlights barely piercing the gloom. Pavel brought up the rear, his knife gripped tightly in one hand. He paused briefly, turning to glance behind them. "Keep moving," Victor barked. Pavel nodded, but the expression on his face spoke of something he wasn't saying. Something had been following them, and it was getting closer. The tunnel eventually opened into a cavernous chamber. The reactor core loomed ahead, its skeletal structure bathed in an unnatural, bluish glow. The air here was different, thick and electric, buzzing with unseen energy. The Geiger counter screamed in protest, its needle pinned at maximum. "This is it," Victor said. "The source." Lena stared in awe, her scientific curiosity warring with her fear. "It's beautiful and horrifying." The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the whispers grew deafening. Shadows began to coalesce, forming humanoid figures that flickered in and out of existence. Anna raised her camera instinctively, snapping photos, but the images on her screen were distorted, as though the figures were too alien to be captured. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It raised a hand, pointing directly at Victor. Its voice was a chorus of overlapping tones, each word reverberating in their skulls. "You remember." Victor's face hardened, a flicker of guilt crossing his eyes. "I remember," he said softly. "What does it mean?" Anna demanded. "What did you do?" Before Victor could answer, the figure lunged. Pavel reacted instinctively, slashing at it with his knife, but his blade passed through the creature as though it were smoke. The creature retaliated, its form wrapping around Pavel like living mist. His screams echoed through the chamber as his body convulsed, and then he fell silent. "Run!" Victor shouted, firing at the other figures as they advanced. Anna and Lena bolted, Victor covering their retreat. The shadows surged forward, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. The three survivors raced toward the reactor, the glow growing brighter with each step. Behind them, the chamber collapsed, the shadows consuming everything in their path. They reached the edge of the reactor core, the air so thick with radiation that their monitors crackled wildly before shorting out entirely. Lena collapsed, coughing violently. Victor hauled her to her feet, his expression grim. "This ends here," he said. "We destroy it, or we die trying." Anna stared at him, her heart pounding. "How? How do we destroy something like this?" Victor pulled a small device from his pack, a crude bomb fashioned from scavenged materials. "This will do it," he said. "But one of us has to stay behind to activate it." Lena's eyes widened in horror. "You can't be serious." "I am," Victor replied. "This is the only way." Before anyone could argue, the shadows surged forward, their distorted forms filling the chamber. Time was running out. Chapter 4: Sacrifice in the Heart of Darkness. The oppressive hum of the reactor filled the chamber, vibrating through their very bones. The shadows closed in, writhing and twisting as though fueled by the unnatural energy radiating from the core. Victor stood at the edge of the room, his hand gripping the detonator, his face a mask of grim resolve. Anna and Lena looked at him, their expressions a mix of terror and disbelief. "We can't just leave you here," Anna shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "There's no other way." Victor barked, his eyes locking onto hers. "If this thing doesn't end now, it will spread. The zone will consume everything." Lena clutched Anna's arm, her breathing shallow and ragged. "He's right. The readings, they're off the charts. This place, it's alive. If we don't destroy it, it'll only grow stronger." Anna's heart raced as she tried to process the magnitude of what Victor was saying. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the nightmare behind, but something deeper, a sense of responsibility, perhaps, rooted her to the spot. The shadows surged forward, their forms growing more distinct. They were no longer vague silhouettes, but fully formed figures, faces flickering in and out of recognition. Anna gasped as she recognized some of them, the man in the hazmat suit, a child clutching a ragged teddy bear, a woman whose hollow eyes seemed to pierce through her. "They're the victims," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "The ones who died here. They're trapped, tethered to the reactor's energy." The figures began to speak, their voices a haunting symphony of pain and despair. "Join us. You cannot escape. We are one." Victor stepped forward, his pistol raised. "Stay back," he shouted, though it was unclear whether he was warning the shadows or his companions. The figures halted momentarily, as if considering his defiance. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, they lunged. Victor fired, but the bullets passed through the apparitions harmlessly. Anna grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her toward a narrow corridor leading away from the reactor. "Go!" Victor yelled, his voice raw with urgency. "Get to the surface." Anna hesitated, her eyes meeting his one last time. "We'll come back for you." Victor didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the detonator, his fingers trembling slightly as he activated the timer. A low beat began, marking the countdown, 5 minutes. Anna and Lena ran, their footsteps echoing through the corridor. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing thicker with every step. Lena stumbled, clutching her chest, her breath shallow and labored. I can't go any further," she gasped, collapsing to her knees. Anna knelt beside her, her mind racing. "We have to keep moving, Lena. We're almost there." Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "The radiation, it's too much. You need to go. Leave me." "No," Anna said firmly, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." The shadows began to seep into the corridor, their whispers growing louder. Anna looked back, her heart sinking as she saw the apparitions closing in. She grabbed Lena's arm, trying to pull her to her feet, but Lena resisted. "Go!" Lena screamed, pushing Anna away. "You have to tell the world what happened here. Don't let it all be for nothing." Anna hesitated for a split second before the urgency of the situation overtook her. She nodded, her tears blurring her vision, and ran. The corridor twisted and turned, each step feeling like an eternity. The whispers pursued her, growing louder and more chaotic. The air was filled with a cacophony of voices, each one a plea or warning. Anna's legs burned, her lungs felt like they would burst, but she didn't stop. Finally, she burst into the open air. The sight of the decaying landscape was almost a relief after the suffocating darkness of the reactor. She stumbled forward, collapsing onto the ground, her chest heaving as she gulped in the cold, tainted air. A deafening explosion shattered the silence, the ground shaking violently beneath her. She turned to see a column of fire and debris shooting into the sky, the reactor engulfed in a blinding light. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire zone held its breath. Then, the light faded, and a strange, almost peaceful stillness settled over the landscape. Anna sat there, her body trembling, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Victor was gone. Lena was gone. She was the only one left. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed meaningless in the aftermath. Eventually, Anna forced herself to stand. She needed to leave the zone, to find help, to tell the world what had happened. She began to walk, her steps unsteady but determined. The path back to the van was long and treacherous. The zone seemed quieter now, its oppressive presence diminished but not entirely gone. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the shadows still lingered just out of sight. When she finally reached the van, it was a wreck. The tires were slashed, the windows shattered, and the interior covered in a fine layer of ash. Anna rummaged through the supplies, finding a map and a working flashlight. She would have to make the journey on foot. As she set out, the whispers returned, fainter this time, but still present. She paused, looking back at the reactor in the distance. For a moment, she thought she saw figures standing in the ruins, watching her. It looked like Victor, but she couldn't be sure. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. The journey out of the zone was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Anna's thoughts were a whirlwind of memories, questions, and guilt. She had survived, but at what cost? And what would she tell the world? Would anyone even believe her? As the edge of the exclusion zone came into view, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. Anna collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She was alive. Against all odds, she had made it out. But the zone had changed her. She would never be the same. And as she sat there, staring at the rising sun, she couldn't shake the feeling that the zone wasn't finished with her yet. Chapter 5. the weight of survival. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the desolate edge of the exclusion zone. Anna sat on a crumbling concrete slab, staring at the faint silhouettes of abandoned buildings in the distance. The weight of what she had endured pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The silence was deafening, yet her mind buzzed with fragments of whispers that refused to leave her. She reached for her camera, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the photos. Distorted images of shadows and faint, ghostly figures stared back at her. Each shot was a reminder of the horrors she had witnessed, of the lives lost in the reactor's relentless grasp. Victor's stoic gaze, Lena's curious smile, even Pavel's hardened scowl, they all haunted her now, their absence a sharp ache in her heart. A distant sound broke through her thoughts, the rumble of an engine. Anna scrambled to her feet, her pulse quickening as she saw a military vehicle approaching. She waved her arms frantically, relief washing over her as the truck came to a halt. Two men in hazmat suits stepped out, their expressions hidden behind reflective visors. "Are you hurt?" one of them asked, his voice muffled by the respirator. "I'm fine," Anna replied, though her voice wavered. I need to speak to someone in charge. There's something in the reactor, something alive." The men exchanged glances before motioning for her to climb into the vehicle. Anna hesitated, a sliver of doubt creeping into her mind. But she had no other choice. If she didn't tell someone, all of it, Victor's sacrifice, Lena's discovery, Pavel's bravery, would be for nothing. The ride back to the checkpoint was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Anna stared out the window, watching the landscape shift from the haunting ruins of the zone to the barren outskirts of safety. The whispers grew fainter, their presence fading with the distance, but she could still feel them, like a shadow clinging to her soul. When they arrived at the military base, Anna was ushered into a sterile room with bright fluorescent lights. A stern-faced officer entered, his uniform crisp and his demeanor cold. He introduced himself as Colonel Markov, his piercing gaze studying her intently. "Miss Ivanova," he began, "you've been through a great ordeal. I need you to tell me everything." Anna recounted the events, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She spoke of the shadows, the experiments, the whispers that seemed to echo from the reactor itself. She described the sacrifice Victor had made, the strange apparitions that had pursued them, and the explosion that had seemingly silenced the horrors. Markov listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Anna finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally. "You're claiming that the reactor itself was alive?" "It wasn't just alive," Anna insisted. "It was aware. It wanted us to stay, to join it. Victor destroyed it, but," she hesitated, her voice faltering. "I don't think it's gone. Not entirely." Markov's expression darkened. "You realize the implications of what you're saying. If word of this gets out, it could cause widespread panic. The zone is already a place of fear and mystery. Adding supernatural claims will only make things worse." Anna's stomach churned. "I'm not making this up. You have to believe me." Markov stood, his movements deliberate. "We'll investigate your claims. For now, you'll remain here under observation. It's for your own safety." The door closed behind him with a finality that made Anna's chest tighten. She was alone again, trapped in a new kind of isolation. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time had lost all meaning. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with the faces of the dead, their whispers pulling her back to the reactor. Eventually, a new figure entered the room, a woman in a white lab coat, her kind smile failing to mask the sharpness in her eyes. "Miss Ivanova, I'm Dr. Karina. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Anna nodded numbly, her exhaustion sapping her will to resist. Dr. Karina's questions were probing, her tone gentle but insistent. Anna answered as best she could, though she could feel the doctor's skepticism. "Do you often experience vivid dreams?" Karina asked. "Or hear voices when you're alone?" "They weren't dreams," Anna snapped, her frustration boiling over. "And the voices, they're real. If you had been there, you'd understand." Dr. Karina nodded sympathetically. I understand this has been a traumatic experience. The zone has a way of affecting people. Radiation can cause hallucinations, paranoia. It wasn't the radiation. Anna interrupted. It was something else, something they created. Karina's expression softened. Rest for now. We'll talk again soon. Days turned into weeks. Anna was allowed to leave the observation room, but she was confined to the base. She watched as soldiers and scientists came and went, their movements efficient and purposeful. No one spoke to her about the investigation, and her requests for updates were met with polite deflection. One night, as she lay staring at the ceiling, Anna heard it, the faintest whisper. Her blood ran cold as the voice grew louder, more insistent. Anna. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The room was empty, but the whisper persisted, weaving through her thoughts like a dark thread. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the zone had not let her go. It was still with her, waiting. The next morning, she demanded to see Colonel Markov. You have to let me leave, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The zone won't stop until I'm gone. Markov studied her for a long moment before nodding. You're free to go, he said. But understand this, you can never speak of what happened. For your own safety, and for the safety of others. Anna agreed, though the words felt hollow. She knew the truth wouldn't stay buried forever. As she left the base and stepped into the world beyond, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The zone was behind her, but its shadow would follow her for the rest of her life. Months later, Anna sat in a small apartment far from Chernobyl, her camera and notes spread across the table. She stared at the distorted images and scribbled fragments, her mind replaying the events over and over. The whispers had faded, but the memories remained, vivid and unrelenting. One night, as she worked late into the evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single line, typed in shaky text, "It's not over." Anna stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced toward the window, half expecting to see the shadows of the zone lurking outside. But the street was empty, silent. The zone's reach was far greater than she had imagined. And deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before it called her back. Imagine a forgotten asylum deep in the woods, sealed for decades after a series of unexplained deaths. When a group of explorers ventures inside, the echoes of its dark past awaken. Listen closely, some truths should never be uncovered, and some doors should never be opened. Chapter 1. The Asylum Beckons. The road to Ash Grove Asylum was narrow and overgrown, winding through a forest that seemed untouched by time. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the late afternoon sun. A chill hung in the air despite the summer season, and the group of 5 friends felt its weight settle over them as they approached their destination. Emily, the unofficial leader of their little band, clutched a flashlight in one hand and an old map in the other. Her fiery determination to uncover forgotten places had led them here, to the crumbling ruins of a facility shrouded in local legend. Behind her, Matt lugged a bulky camera, muttering about how they better find something worth documenting. His girlfriend, Clara, stayed close, her anxious eyes darting toward every shadow. Rounding out the group were Liam, the skeptic who claimed not to believe in ghosts, and Sophie, whose curiosity rivaled Emily's but with a nervous edge. As the asylum came into view, the group fell silent. The building was a hulking mass of decaying brick and shattered windows, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Ivy crept along the walls, trying to reclaim the structure for nature. A rusted sign hung at a precarious angle near the entrance, its faded lettering still legible, Ash Grove Mental Institution. "This place gives me the creeps," Clara said, clutching Matt's arm. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" "Relax," Emily replied, her tone brisk. "It's just an old building. There's nothing here but dust and stories." Liam smirked. "Yeah, and rats. Probably a ton of rats." Sophie shivered. "Let's just stick together, okay?" Emily led the way, her flashlight cutting through the dim light as they stepped through the broken double doors. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. Peeling paint curled off the walls, and debris littered the floors. The group's footsteps echoed loudly in the vast emptiness. "Let's split up," Emily suggested, ignoring the collective groan from her friends. "We'll cover more ground that way. Matt, Clara, and I will take the west wing. Liam, Sophie, you explore the east." "Great," Liam muttered, rolling his eyes. Split up in a creepy old asylum. What could go wrong? Despite their unease, they followed Emily's plan. Matt adjusted his camera, eager to capture the eerie atmosphere, while Clara stuck close, her unease growing with every step. Sophie and Liam headed in the opposite direction, their flashlight beams casting long shadows along the cracked walls. As they explored, whispers seemed to float through the air, soft, indistinct, just on the edge of hearing. Clara paused, her grip tightening on Matt's sleeve. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Matt asked, distracted as he fiddled with his camera. "It sounded like someone whispering." Emily glanced back at them, her expression impatient. "It's just the wind. Let's keep moving." But Clara wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the darkness held more than just shadows. As they ventured deeper into the west wing, her unease turned to outright fear. Meanwhile, in the east wing, Sophie and Liam moved cautiously through the labyrinth of hallways. Sophie stopped in front of a room marked Ward 13, its door ajar. The air inside was colder, and a faint metallic scent lingered. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The room was empty save for a single chair bolted to the floor, its straps frayed and stained. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she noticed scratch marks etched deeply into the walls, as though made by desperate hands. "This place is so messed up," Liam said, standing in the doorway. "Who even thought this was a good idea?" Before Sophie could respond, the flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering like a dying heartbeat. A low groan echoed through the room, sending a shiver down their spines. Sophie grabbed Liam's arm, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Liam nodded, his bravado fading as the groan turned into a faint, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Back in the west wing, Emily pushed open a set of heavy doors that led into what appeared to be the main treatment area. The room was cavernous, its high ceilings lost in shadow. Broken gurneys and rusted equipment were scattered about, and the faint outline of a nurse's station loomed in the center. "This is amazing," Matt said, his camera whirring as he recorded. "Imagine the footage we're going to get." Clara, however, wasn't impressed. "We should go back. Something feels wrong." Emily ignored her, shining her flashlight toward a set of double doors at the far end of the room. "Let's check what's back there." But as she stepped forward, the room seemed to shift. The shadows grew deeper, swallowing the edges of the space. The faint whispering Clara had heard earlier returned, louder now, insistent. It was no longer just indistinct murmurs, it was voices, overlapping and chaotic. "Emily," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "We need to go." "Just a little further," Emily insisted, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The whispers became a roar, and a sudden, chilling gust of wind slammed the double doors shut behind them. The flashlight beams faltered, and in the brief flicker of light, Clara swore she saw figures, vague, distorted, and watching. "What the hell is happening?" Matt shouted, his camera slipping from his hands. Emily gripped her flashlight tightly, her voice shaking. "I don't know. Just stay close." But as the darkness closed in, and the voices grew louder, one thing became clear: Ashgrove Asylum was not as empty as they had believed. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Dark. The heavy doors of the treatment room slammed shut with a metallic clang, the sound reverberating through the decaying walls. Clara clung to Matt's arm, her breath coming in short gasps. Emily spun around, shining her flashlight toward the doors, but they remained firmly closed. The whispering grew louder, an unintelligible cacophony of voices surrounding them. "What's going on?" Clara's voice trembled, her wide eyes darting to every shadow. Emily swallowed hard, her own nerves beginning to fray. "It's just the wind. Or maybe the old ventilation system." "Stop lying to yourself," Matt muttered, his camera hanging limply at his side. That wasn't the wind. As they huddled together, the air in the room grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light. A faint shuffling sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness, sending a chill down Emily's spine. She tried to steel herself, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Stay together. Let's head back to the main entrance," she said, leading them toward the doors they had entered through. She grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if an unseen force held it shut. "Emily," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Emily turned to see Clara pointing toward the nurse's station. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. It was humanoid but wrong, its movements jerky, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Emily's flashlight flickered as she aimed it toward the station, but by the time the beam stabilized, the figure was gone. "Nope. Nope. Nope." Matt backed away, dragging Clara with him. "We're not staying here." "We don't have a choice," Emily snapped, her voice tinged with panic. "We need to find another way out." Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Liam and Sophie were not faring much better. The mocking laughter they had heard in Ward 13 followed them as they retraced their steps, growing louder and more distorted. Liam's bravado had evaporated entirely, and Sophie clung to his arm, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Do you see that?" Sophie whispered, her beam catching movement down the hall. Liam squinted, his eyes narrowing as he saw a figure emerge from one of the rooms. It was small, childlike, and its head jerked unnaturally with every step. The figure turned toward them, and Sophie let out a strangled gasp. Its face was pale and featureless, a blank canvas where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. "Run," Liam hissed, grabbing Sophie's hand and pulling her down the corridor. They sprinted through the labyrinth of hallways, their panicked footsteps echoing off the walls. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the asylum itself were alive and feeding off their fear. Every door they tried was either locked or led to dead ends. The laughter followed them, joined by whispers that grew louder and more distinct. "Why did you come here?" a voice hissed, disembodied and chilling. "You don't belong." Sophie stumbled, falling to her knees. Liam skidded to a stop, pulling her up. "Come on, we have to keep moving." "I can't," Sophie gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can't breathe." Liam turned, his own fear momentarily forgotten as he tried to calm her. "We're going to get out of here. I promise." Before he could say more, the air around them seemed to ripple. The laughter and whispers grew deafening, and the hallway ahead twisted impossibly, folding in on itself like a nightmare come to life. Shadows seeped from the walls, coalescing into shapes that moved with deliberate malice. Back in the West Wing, Emily, Matt, and Clara managed to pry open a side door, stumbling into a narrow stairwell. The stairs spiraled downward, their end lost in darkness. A faint light flickered below, and Emily hesitated. "Do we really want to go deeper into this place?" Matt asked, his voice low. "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, already descending the steps. "The front entrance is blocked, and the windows are too high. There might be another exit down here." Clara hesitated at the top of the stairs, her legs trembling. "This is a bad idea. We should stay where we are and wait for help." "No one's coming," Emily said sharply. "The nearest town is miles away, and no one even knows we're here." Clara reluctantly followed, gripping Matt's arm tightly as they descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the flickering light below resolved into a dim bulb hanging from a frayed wire. They emerged into a basement corridor, its walls lined with crumbling plaster and rusted pipes. "What is this place?" Matt murmured, panning his flashlight across the hall. Emily pointed to a set of metal doors marked archives. "Let's check there. Maybe we'll find a map or something useful." The room was filled with filing cabinets, their contents scattered across the floor. Old photographs, medical charts, and handwritten notes lay in disarray, covered in dust and mildew. Emily picked up a folder, her curiosity piqued despite the fear gnawing at her. "These are patient files," she said, flipping through the pages. This place wasn't just an asylum. They were doing experiments. Clara recoiled. What kind of experiments? Emily scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. Psychological conditioning, sensory deprivation, and something called the Meridian Project. They were trying to merge minds. It doesn't make sense. Matt picked up a photograph from the pile, his face pale. What about this? The photo showed a group of patients in hospital gowns, their faces obscured by black smudges. Behind them stood a tall figure in a white coat, its face blank like the child Sophie and Liam had seen. Emily stared at the image, a chill running down her spine. Let's go, she said, shoving the folder into her bag. We've seen enough. But as they turned to leave, the shadows in the room deepened, and the whispers returned. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the light bulb above them flickered and died. In the suffocating darkness, a voice spoke, low, guttural, and full of malice. You shouldn't have come. Chapter 3, The Asylum Awakens. The room plunged into complete darkness, leaving Emily, Matt, and Clara frozen in place. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of Clara's shaky breathing. Then, the voice returned, closer now, resonating from every corner. You will not leave. Emily fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers trembling as she clicked it on. The narrow beam illuminated the chaos of the archive room, scattered papers, overturned chairs, and shadows that seemed to shift on their own. Matt grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her closer as he swung his own flashlight around, desperately searching for the source of the voice. There's nothing here, Matt whispered, his voice betraying the panic he was trying to suppress. Keep looking, Emily hissed, stepping cautiously toward the door. We need to find a way out. Before she could reach the exit, a deafening crash echoed through the room. The filing cabinets toppled as though pushed by an invisible force, sending papers flying into the air. Clara let out a sharp scream, clutching Matt's arm tightly. Stop, she shouted into the darkness. Just stop. The chaos subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the room eerily still. But the air felt heavier now, charged with a malevolence that seemed to seep into their very bones. Emily swallowed hard, her resolve faltering as the flashlight beam caught something etched into the wall, a single word scratched deep into the plaster. Stay. Matt shook his head, his face pale. We're leaving. Now. Emily nodded, gripping her flashlight like a lifeline. They moved toward the door, stepping over the debris that littered the floor. As they reached the exit, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter. Don't look back, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They entered the basement corridor, the dim light from their flashlights casting long, distorted shadows on the crumbling walls. The air grew colder with each step, and an unsettling stillness enveloped them as though the asylum itself were holding its breath. Do you hear that? Clara whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. Matt stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a rhythmic tapping echoed through the hallway, growing louder with every passing second. It was coming from ahead. What the hell is that? Matt muttered, gripping Clara's hand tightly. Emily's jaw tightened. I don't know, but we're not going back. Keep moving. They followed the corridor, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. As they rounded a corner, their flashlight beams illuminated a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a man, or at least what resembled one. His back was hunched, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He held a long, rusted pole in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against the floor. Who's there? Emily called out, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound authoritative. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward them, its jerky, unnatural steps sending a wave of dread through the group. The tapping grew erratic, the sound echoing off the walls like a manic heartbeat. Run! Matt yelled, grabbing Clara's arm and bolting down the hallway. Emily hesitated for a split second, her curiosity warring with her survival instincts, before she turned and followed. The sound of the tapping grew louder and faster, and the figure's uneven footsteps seemed to gain speed, its presence pressing closer. The group burst into another room, slamming the door behind them. Emily shoved a metal shelf against the door, her heart pounding as the tapping stopped abruptly. They stood in tense silence, their breathing heavy, waiting for the inevitable. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unbroken. What was that? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Emily admitted, wiping sweat from her brow. But it's not following us. The room they had entered appeared to be an old operating theater, its once sterile walls now stained and crumbling. A rusted surgical table stood in the center, its straps frayed and hanging limply. Instruments lay scattered across the floor, their edges dulled with age. This just keeps getting worse, Matt muttered, his flashlight beam sweeping over the room. Emily stepped closer to the table, her flashlight catching something carved into its surface. It was another word, etched deep into the metal with trembling precision. Hurt. Emily, Clara said, her voice shaking, we shouldn't be here. Emily nodded, her usual determination replaced by unease. We need to find Liam and Sophie. We can't leave without them. As if summoned by her words, a faint sound echoed from somewhere beyond the room. It was a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably Sophie's. Help me. Clara's eyes widened. That's her. We have to go to her. Emily hesitated. The voice was weak and disjointed, as though it were coming from somewhere far away, or through something not entirely human. Are you sure that's her? Matt asked, his grip tightening on Clara's arm. It could be something else. Clara shook her head. It's her. I know it. Without waiting for the others, Clara darted toward the sound, pushing open a side door and disappearing into the corridor beyond. Clara, wait! Emily shouted, rushing after her. Matt cursed under his breath and followed, the three of them plunging deeper into the asylum. The corridors twisted and turned, each one looking more decrepit than the last. The voice grew louder, its tone increasingly desperate. Please, help me. They rounded a corner and found themselves in front of a massive set of double doors. The voice was louder now, coming from just beyond them. This has to be it, Clara said, her hands shaking as she pushed the doors open. The room beyond was cavernous, its high ceilings lost in shadow. Rows of beds lined the walls, their frames rusted and broken. And in the center of the room stood Sophie, or at least, something that looked like her. She was facing away from them, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her body swayed slightly, as though she were suspended by invisible strings. Sophie? Clara called out, stepping forward. Don't, Emily said, grabbing her arm. Something's wrong. The figure turned slowly, its movements disjointed and wrong. Its face was pale and distorted, Sophie's features stretched and twisted into a grotesque mimicry of humanity. Its eyes, empty voids of darkness, locked onto Clara. Help me, it said, its voice a distorted echo. Clara screamed. Chapter 4, The Final Escape. Clara stumbled backward, her scream echoing through the cavernous room. The figure that had once resembled Sophie stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. Emily yanked Clara back, her flashlight trembling in her grip as she swung it toward the creature. The beam flickered across its grotesque form, revealing the full extent of its unnatural contortions. Run! Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the oppressive air. Matt grabbed Clara's arm, dragging her toward the door. Emily followed, her heart pounding as the figure let out an ear-piercing wail. The shadows around them seemed to pulse with the sound, stretching and twisting like living entities. The doors slammed shut behind them as they fled, leaving the creature's distorted cries muffled but still audible. We have to get out of here. Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. That wasn't Sophie, it wasn't her. I know, Emily replied, her voice tight. But we're not leaving without Liam. He's still out there. Matt hesitated, his face pale. Emily, we might not make it if we keep searching. Whatever this place is, it's alive. It doesn't want us to leave. Emily's jaw clenched, her resolve hardening. We're not abandoning him. The three of them pressed on, moving deeper into the asylum. The hallways seemed to shift around them, turning into a maze of identical corridors. Every turn felt like a step closer to madness. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing in their minds. Don't leave us. Stay. You belong here. Emily fought to keep her focus, forcing herself to ignore the voices. They turned a corner and froze. Ahead of them, a faint light flickered, a pale, blue glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And in the center of the corridor, slumped against the wall, was Liam. Liam! Clara cried, running to him. He was alive, but barely. His face was pale, his breath shallow. He looked up at Clara with bloodshot eyes, his voice weak. You came back. Of course we did, Clara said, her voice breaking. We're getting you out of here. Matt and Emily crouched beside him, helping him to his feet. But as they turned to leave, the light intensified and the whispers grew deafening. The walls began to ripple and crack, as though the asylum itself were coming apart. We have to move, now! Emily shouted. The group stumbled forward, half carrying Liam as the ground beneath them trembled. The shadows surged along the walls, coalescing into humanoid forms that reached out with clawed hands. One of them lunged at Matt, its fingers grazing his arm and leaving a searing burn. Keep going! Matt yelled, shoving Clara and Liam ahead of him. They turned another corner and found themselves in front of a staircase. The dim light of the exit sign above it was the first sign of hope they'd seen in hours. Emily's heart leapt at the sight, but the ground shook violently, and a deafening roar echoed from the depths of the asylum. It's collapsing! Matt shouted. Go! 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 They scrambled up the stairs, the tremors growing more violent with every step. Clara clung to Liam, practically dragging him as Emily and Matt pushed ahead, clearing the path. The whispers turned into screams, voices filled with rage and despair. You can't leave us. You belong here. Stay forever. As they reached the top of the stairs, the door burst open, revealing the pale light of dawn. The cool morning air hit their faces like a lifeline. Emily turned back, her flashlight catching one last glimpse of the shadows surging up the stairwell, their forms twisting and writhing in fury. Move, she yelled, shoving the others through the door. The group stumbled into the open air, collapsing onto the overgrown lawn outside the asylum. Behind them, the building groaned, its structure sagging as if the weight of its malevolence were finally too much to bear. The walls began to crumble, and within moments, the entire structure collapsed in on itself, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the sky. For a long moment, no one spoke. They lay there, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. The silence that followed was almost unnerving after the chaos they had escaped. Is it over? Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily nodded, but she wasn't entirely sure. It's gone. The asylum, it's gone. Matt sat up, cradling his burned arm. What the hell was that place? A nightmare, Liam said weakly, his voice hoarse. And I never want to talk about it again. Emily helped him to his feet, her gaze lingering on the ruins of the asylum. The building was no more, reduced to rubble and ash. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. We made it, she said, more to herself than anyone else. That's what matters. As the sun rose higher, bathing the forest in golden light, the group began their slow journey back to the road. They were battered, scarred, and haunted by what they had experienced, but they were alive. And for now, that was enough. Emily glanced over her shoulder one last time, her hand tightening around her flashlight. The asylum was gone, but its shadows would remain with them forever. Chapter 5, Shadows Never Truly Fade. The walk back to the road felt endless, the dense forest seeming to close in around them. The group was silent, their minds replaying the horrors they had just escaped. Emily walked ahead, her flashlight now useless in the growing daylight, but she kept it in her hand like a talisman. Clara stayed close to Liam, who leaned heavily on her, his strength fading with every step. Matt trailed behind, his arm bandaged with a torn piece of his shirt, his eyes scanning the trees as though expecting something to follow them. The eerie calm of the forest felt wrong, unnatural. Even the birds were silent, their absence a stark contrast to the usual morning sounds of wildlife. "We're almost there," Emily said, her voice breaking the tense quiet. But her words felt hollow, none of them truly believed they were safe yet. When they finally reached the road, the sight of their van brought a wave of relief. The vehicle was just as they'd left it, parked haphazardly along the narrow dirt path. Emily fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she unlocked the doors. "Get in," she said, her tone clipped. "We're leaving." They piled into the van, Clara helping Liam into the back seat while Matt took the passenger side, cradling his injured arm. Emily slid into the driver's seat, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror as she started the engine. For a moment, the van hesitated, the engine sputtering as if the asylum's shadow still held sway over them. Then, with a reluctant roar, it came to life. As they drove away, the forest thinned, and the tension in the van began to ease. The warm light of the sun streaming through the windows felt like a balm, a promise of normalcy just beyond the horizon. But the relief was short-lived. "I keep hearing it," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hearing what?" Matt asked, turning to look at her. "The whispers," she replied, her eyes wide and haunted. "They're faint, but they're still there." Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you. After what we've been through, it's normal." But Matt shook his head, his face pale. "She's not wrong. I hear them too." The van fell silent, save for the hum of the engine. The faintest murmur began to fill the space, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was the same whispering voices they had heard in the asylum, faint and persistent. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart skipping a beat. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road behind them, its pale face blank and staring. She blinked, and it was gone. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice sharp. "We'll be out of the forest soon." But the whispers grew louder, and with them came a sense of dread that settled over the group like a heavy fog. Liam stirred in the back seat, his breathing shallow. He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. "It's not over," he murmured, his voice distant. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, leaning over him. "The asylum, it's part of something bigger," he said, his words coming haltingly. "It let us go, but it's not gone. It's waiting." Emily's stomach churned. Waiting for what? Liam's eyes met hers, and for a moment they seemed darker, as though a shadow had passed over him. "For us to bring it back." The van jerked as Emily's hands slipped on the wheel, the vehicle veering slightly before she corrected it. "What the hell does that mean?" Before Liam could answer, the whispers surged, filling the van with an oppressive noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The windows fogged over, and the air grew colder, the light of the sun dimming as though swallowed by an unseen force. Emily slammed on the brakes, the van skidding to a stop. The group sat frozen, their breaths visible in the sudden chill. The whispers subsided, leaving an unnatural silence in their wake. "What's happening?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Emily wiped at the fogged-up windshield, her movements frantic. Outside, the forest was shrouded in an eerie mist, the road ahead and behind obscured. It was as though they had never left the asylum's grasp. "We have to keep moving," Emily said, her voice shaking. She started the van again, the engine roaring back to life. But as she pressed the accelerator, the van wouldn't move. The wheels spun uselessly, the vehicle refusing to budge. "We're trapped," Matt muttered, his voice tinged with despair. "No," Emily said firmly. "We're getting out of here." She threw the door open and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The mist swirled around her, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost intelligible. She turned toward the forest, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. And then she saw it. The asylum, standing impossibly where it shouldn't be, its crumbling structure rising from the mist like a specter. The windows glowed faintly, and the doors stood open, as though inviting her back. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." The others joined her outside, their eyes widening as they saw the impossible sight. Clara clung to Matt, her body trembling. Liam stared at the building, his expression unreadable. "It's calling us," he said softly. "It wants us to finish what we started." Emily shook her head, stepping toward him. "We're not going back. We destroyed it. We saw it collapse." "It doesn't matter," Liam replied, his gaze fixed on the asylum. "It's not a place. It's something else. And it's tied to us now." "No," Emily said, her voice firm. She turned to the others. "We're leaving. Together. No one goes back." With a resolve that felt almost defiant, Emily climbed back into the van, motioning for the others to follow. Reluctantly, they obeyed, the whispers growing louder as they slammed the door shut. Emily gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, and pressed the accelerator. This time, the van moved. The mist began to thin as they drove, the oppressive weight lifting with every mile. The forest gave way to open fields, and the light of the sun returned, warming their chilled bodies. The whispers faded, replaced by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the group let out a collective sigh of relief. The sight of a gas station ahead felt like salvation. Emily pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. For a moment, no one spoke. "We made it," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum's shadow still lingered. As they stepped out into the sunlight, she glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see its looming shape among the trees. There was nothing but the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze. The group vowed never to speak of what they had seen, but the memories stayed with them, etched into their minds like scars. They had escaped, but the asylum was still out there, waiting. And deep down, Emily knew it would call again,